Hi, my name is Kay. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm here to talk about eco-textiles. Larissa and I have been talking about this for what, 3 years, 2 years, a while? Yeah, that's right. And I wasn't even living here yet. So I'm going to talk at first about the basic textiles, the ones that have been around for millennia. And then I'm going to talk more about synthetic textiles and fast fashion, and then talk a bit about how to shop and care for our textiles in more earth-friendly ways. And then we are going to have a craft project using our old unwanted textiles. Yep. So my eldest aunt, she was a master quilter. She passed away in August of 2015, and she left all of her sewing equipment to me. And since then, roughly about a third of my wardrobe have been things that I've made myself. Not this, I can't knit. I've tried, I can't. And it's just like, if I can make a third of my wardrobe for myself, why am I buying the same garbage clothing? Like, that's really up to the quality of clothing that I buy as well. And I've learned a lot. It's not easy information to come by. It does take some deep diving. So I'm going to try to make it a little bit easier for everybody today. The human story is the textile story. Spiders taught us about thread and nets, and now textiles are such a ubiquitous part of our lives that we rarely think about them. We're all wearing textiles right now. The carpet beneath our feet, textiles. The cloth chairs, textiles. Painting on canvases, textiles. The inside of your car. It's all around us, but how often do we talk about it? So human history started with leather and fur, which I don't know much about. I'm not going to get into leather and fur, except if you want it and you can buy secondhand, please do. Then the others are wool, cotton, linen, and silk. These are the main four that have been used around the globe for millennia. Notice that two of them, cotton and linen, come from plants, and two of them, wool and silk, come from animals. And there have been a few more niche older textiles, such as cashmere and angora and hemp, and there are many more, but they're partly because they're not so easy to produce, not so easy to spin, not so easy to ship. That's why they haven't taken off like the other four. It's generally because they're just not that easy. The two main ways that textiles are made are either weaving or knitting. Knitting was invented in the 1100s. Before that, we had something called nålebinding. That's a Finnish word, N-A with the circle above it, L-E, binding. It's very similar to knitting, except you only use one needle and you can only do wool with it. You cannot do nålebinding with any other kind of textile. It has to be wool because you felt it while you're doing it. Woven materials don't stretch. So if something's woven in a certain shape, that's the shape it's going to be until it disintegrates. Do you have a question? Oh, okay. Knitted material stretches more. And then nålebinding and crochet, which is much, much older than knitting, but it uses a lot of material, which is why it's just not that popular. Those also stretch as well, but they're very dense. So they're generally only used for outerwear, such as coats, very thick socks to go over your linen socks and things like that. It's really hard to make a nice scarf or a pair of pants or a corset when something's nålebinded or crocheted or some other way of making it. So it's weaving and knitting. That's the main thing. And I'm going to include my favorite story about how the knitting machine was invented. So there was this engineer during the reign of Queen Elizabeth who was in love with this young lady who was a professional knitter at home. Knitting was a huge industry because women could just do it at home while they're taking care of the kids, while they're cooking, while the men were out getting killed for the empire, but we're not going to get into that. So he was in love with this young lady, and we all know this by the letters that they wrote to each other. And he kept saying, "Oh, I love you so much. I want to court you and I want to marry you." And she kept saying, "No, I'm too busy knitting." And he couldn't take a hint. So he's like, "Well, I'm an engineer and my beloved knits too much to marry me. So I'm going to fix this problem." So he invented the first knitting machine and he brought it to her and said, "Look, this can knit for you and we can get married." And she said, "No, I'm too busy. Sorry." He finally got the hint that she just wasn't interested. So he took his knitting machine to the court of Queen Elizabeth to see if the empire wanted it, because at this point in time, knitwear came from England. Like, that was a major export. The main reason why? Sheep all over the British Isles. It was just this incredible industry they had going. So when he brought this knitting machine to Queen Elizabeth's court, she said, "How dare you put the guilds of knitters out of business? Take this atrocity away." So he took it to the French court and they threw him a parade because he gave them an advantage over England. So again, like, this does greatly impact our lives, but just in ways that we generally don't know about, because this isn't taught in a history class. But if you're wearing knitwear, it's because of that guy, because of one guy who was snubbed by both his girlfriend and Queen Elizabeth. And another part of textiles is dyes. We've been trying to dye fabrics in permanent, safe ways for millennia, trying to make our textiles in whatever color we want, in a way that won't come off when we sweat, won't come off in the rain, and won't poison us to the point that we die. That's really hard to do, especially when the only fixative you have is ammonia and vinegar. That's all we had. If you're wearing something with a natural red dye, not a synthetic red dye, but a natural red, probably called carmine red, that's made with crushed beetles. We've been making red dye the same way for millennia, by crushing these beetles, mixing them with a fixative, and then putting the textile in it. So I'm sorry if there are any vegans listening, you might want to check the red dye, because red textiles are not vegan unless it's synthetic. Blue comes from woad or indigo. The word indigo comes from India woad. Woad is a plant that grows in the British Isles. But when the British Empire went to India, they discovered the indigo plant and they said, "Oh, it's woad, but in India." It's much easier to process, it's much easier to use as a fixative, and it lasts a lot longer, which is why jeans are dyed with indigo. And then, of course, white from ammonia, which, sorry if it grosses you out, but ammonia comes from urine. Like, that's how we figured out what bleach is, by just being like, well, I peed in this thing, I'm going to put some linen in it, let's see what happens. That's why we have white dye. And notice the three colors that I listed: red, blue, and white. Think of all of the flags that include those three colors: the United States, Canada, Australia, British flag, the English flag, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, France, Russia. The reason why these flags are those colors is because those are the dyes that we had. And the reason why the Swedish flag is blue with yellow is because they were showing, look, we can afford saffron. That's it. That's the only reason why there's yellow on the Swedish flag, to show their wealth and their trade and their empire. So as you're guessing, yellow dye originally comes from saffron, very, very expensive and valuable. Purple comes from certain snails. Like in times of the Roman Empire, only the royalty and nobility could wear purple because it was just so expensive to create. It was really reserved for these special people. Pink. Marie Antoinette popularized pink as a luxurious color because up until her reign, we did not have a way to dye textiles pink. The French Empire owned land in Brazil where they had a fixative that would make the pink dye stay on the fabric forever and it wouldn't come off on your skin. So every time you see a painting of Marie Antoinette and she's wearing pink, what she is saying is, look at how wealthy I am. I can afford pink dye from Brazil. And then there's the green dye. We've been trying to dye textiles green in many, many, many different ways for millennia again. The number one way has been with arsenic. You can guess how that goes. There was actually a dye called Paris green in the mid-1800s, which was very, very popular. And then it wasn't anymore because everybody who used it died. There was one place that figured out how to make a green dye that would last and would not come off on your skin. Does anybody know why Robin Hood wears green? Because the person he was based on came from Lincoln in England, and they had a fungus that they could turn into this good green dye. They were the only place in Europe that could do that. So every time you see Robin Hood wearing green, he's showing, look how wealthy I am. I come from the only place that can make this outfit. It was an incredible advantage. The technology necessary to dye any material, any color in a permanent way that won't come off when you sweat on it or gets rained on is only maybe 70 years old. It hasn't been around that long. That's why the clothing trends in the 60s and 70s were so bright, because it's like, look, we can do this now. And then many other things were invented just over the past century. Now, elastic was originally invented in 1820. It was really just used for clasps for gloves and shoes because they really struggled to make like yards and yards and yards of it. They could just make a little bit at a time. If they made more, it just fell apart. So the kind of elastic that you can just buy in a spool, that's really only over the past century. That's why we have bras instead of corsets. Bras exist because of elastic. So whenever somebody's like, oh, well, women wore corsets because of beauty standards, like, no, you'd wear that too if you didn't have elastic. Rayon was mass produced in the 1930s. Now, it's going to get a little sad. I'm going to warn you, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Holocaust. Rayon is made by processing wood pulp and these toxic chemicals that if you inhale them, first thing that happens is you go blind, and then you have psychosis, and then you die. Rayon was extremely popular in the 1930s. You can guess where it was made. If you see a garment made of rayon in the 30s or 40s, you know where it was made. The way that rayon is still made today is the same way. The process hasn't really changed that much. So when you see a rayon garment today and you look where it was made, maybe don't buy garments that come from that place because they're still using the same technology. Polyester was also invented in the 30s, but it took a couple decades to develop into the material that we know today. Spandex was invented in 1958. So the whole athleisure wear trend, it exists just because we have the technology, because it's there. It's easy to make. Most of these materials were created using environmentally disastrous chemicals and do not biodegrade. And I do want to say also acid wash jeans, even though they're still made with cotton most of the time, and they're still usually made with indigo dye, the acid to do the acid wash also doesn't biodegrade, and it can stay in the jeans. So acid wash jeans, you don't really want them to biodegrade because the acid will just go into the water and the dirt. So that's like the basics of the textiles. Fast fashion takes this new technology and really just removes all the quality. When you buy a cheap garment, someone's not getting paid. We buy, own, and dispose of more garments than the vast majority of human beings, and most of it ends up in landfills. When you're thinking of buying a textile, and that could be a shirt, a washcloth, a rug, I mean, really just any textile at all. If you catch yourself thinking, oh, if I don't like it, I can just donate it, don't buy it. When you donate, please try to make sure your donated textiles stay in your region. Like I know Spotsies used to have the like winter gear donation areas, and since they're not in that spot anymore, I don't know if that's still going on, but really garage sales, yard sales, or some kind of clothing exchange will do a lot more to make sure your textiles stay where you are and don't go in a landfill. While there's a chance that your donated garments will go up for sale in a Goodwill or a Salvation Army or St. Vincent de Paul, if it doesn't sell within a certain amount of time, it will be removed and shipped elsewhere. Unwanted garments, especially low-value items like t-shirts, get shipped from North America and Northern Europe, and they usually wind up in sub-Saharan Africa, such as Ghana, Kenya, and Rwanda. Although some of these companies claim these donations help start small businesses there, not only are there so many tons of donated garments that there's really just no money to be made because everybody has tons of clothing to sell to each other. Like you're just selling it to each other. It's kind of like a pyramid scheme. And also, they need to spend extraordinary resources to try to store these tons of clothings that come. Sometimes their bales, because they're shipped in bales, just like hay, the bales will come and they'll be wet, they'll be moldy, they'll have rats and bugs. They just get put in a landfill because they don't have the resources to take care of that. And besides, they're just going to get another ship in a week. So why go through the effort? And the landfill your donated fast fashion ends up in will probably be in Africa. So many old garments get donated that figuring out what to do with them has taken time and labor away from creating and sustaining local industry in sub-Saharan Africa. Even the people who have been selling these used garments there for decades have noticed a drop in quality, especially since fast fashion such as Forever 21 and H&M have gotten more popular. The quality has dropped. People on the other side of the globe have noticed. So you turning your old t-shirt into a rug, a rag, a quilt, or a grocery bag will put it to much, much better use. If you want to know where I'm getting all these sources, I used sustainablereview.com. So I'm not just coming this out of nowhere. Like you can look it up. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not here to shame anyone unless you own a sweatshop. I'm guessing nobody here owns a sweatshop. Okay, you're all fine. And I'm not going to say there is one way to approach textiles ethically. The people who decide how mass-produced textiles get made, processed, shipped, sold, donated, and trashed probably aren't listening to me right now. So I'm just going to act like we're all normal people who are just trying to figure out how to do the right thing with our means. Look at the textiles in your life and ask, how much control do you have over them? You probably can't do much about the textiles inside of your car. And if you're going to buy a new car and you ask, where was the chair made? Who made it? What is it made out of? You're probably not going to get that many answers because not that many people ask. Mattresses and upholsterers furniture are intentionally made of fire-safe material. Although these aren't that good for the earth as flammable materials like cotton and feathers, having fewer house fires in general just benefits everybody. So if you decide to keep getting the fire-safe upholstery, like it's okay. Having fewer fires is a good thing. And the main thing is preserve what you already have. Reduce the new items you purchase as you're able, reuse what you can, and buy used when possible. If your takeaway from this is to run out and buy a whole bunch of new stuff that says save the earth on it, that's not the message I'm giving you. Please don't do that. Like, I don't know how many of you remember back in like 2008, green is the new black was like this big trendy thing that was going on, and everybody went out and got t-shirts, but nothing changed. People just bought t-shirts and then they all got donated a couple years later. Like, when something says it's being sustainable or green or earth friendly, please ask what that means, because H&M is saying that right now. They're not doing anything. Like, it doesn't go anywhere. I don't know how many people here know what yarn bombing is. Yarn bombing is when you knit or crochet or just put yarn outside in a decorative way. Please don't do that, because usually it's very cheap acrylic yarn, which firstly does not biodegrade. I mean, you might as well just go outside with a plastic bottle and a cheese grater and just grate the bottle, because that's what the yarn is. And also when people put the yarn, regardless of what the yarn is made of, put it on a tree and then it rains, it'll hold in molds and fungi that will make the tree sick. So if you do want to put yarn outside, please use wool or cotton. And if you want to use linen or silk, go for it, but it sounds really expensive. And please try to make sure it's used with some kind of natural dye, and just don't put it on something that's alive. When you do buy new textiles, buy it long term. If you're thinking like, oh, I'm just going to get this towel to take to the beach and then I'll put it in a closet, never thinking about it again, maybe don't. I mean, it's a lot better for the earth and for your wallet to just like get a nice set of towels, use it. And if you end up taking your bath towel to the beach instead of getting a whole new beach towel that disintegrates in 3 months, that's okay. I won't judge you at the beach. When you do wash your textiles, wash gently and hang dry when possible, especially when it comes to polyester and acrylic and other synthetic materials, because when that goes through the like electronic washer and dryer, the plastic material will shred off and go out in the water from the washing machine and will be blown out with the air from the dryer. That, again, just think of it as plastic bottle going through a cheese grater, because that's what it is. Learn to sew. Really, if you're just learning how to reattach a button or to darn socks, that can really help your textiles last a lot longer. You don't need to be creating masterful quilts and all this great stuff, but really just vast majority of human beings have maintained the textiles that they've had for decades. We're the weird ones for not doing that. And textiles, like, this is something for us to be in relationship with. It's not just temporary garbage. Like, this is something that has been a part of our lives since we've discovered spider webs. So it's okay to be in a relationship with the textiles in your life, because if you're doing that and you're taking care of them, you're helping to stop fast fashion and you're helping keeping things out of landfills. Check on local tailors. If you have a blazer or something that's a little bit beyond your sewing level, like, don't worry, blazers are beyond my level too. Check local tailors. A lot of shops like Nordstrom and Buckle have their own tailors. So if you're going to Nordstrom, like the new one that we're getting in Dubuque, and you buy something, they can tailor it for you. They can tailor it right there on the spot. And then the receipt will say, if you keep the receipt and you bring it back within a certain amount of time, we'll tailor it for you. Like, keep the receipt, take a picture of it. I know in Dubuque, there's Sun Alterations and Jan's Sotique. They do alterations and tailoring. I Googled just tailoring Galena, and all I got was Ann Chapman. I couldn't find anything else. It just said Yelp reviews for Ann Chapman, and there are no reviews. So I don't know if that's still happening. I was hoping maybe somebody here would know. No, okay. Maybe Google just hasn't caught up yet. Research where your textiles come from, especially when it comes to cheap online sellers like Shein or Temu or Fashion Nova. They have to leave a paper trail. They legally have to leave a paper trail to say, this is where this comes from. Follow the trail, see where it goes. Ask questions. Like, the worst thing that's going to happen is they're not going to reply to your email or phone call. And lastly, there are some textiles that you buy that you have to buy new. Like, I'm not going to tell anybody to buy used underwear. And yes, eventually they are going to wear out and you will have to toss them. That's okay. Again, I'm not telling you to go out and save the world with your textiles right now. These are just things to keep in mind and some tips to try to help reduce the flow. I do recommend for undergarments that you have to buy new, packed organic. That's where EARPACT.com. It's all organic cotton, and they usually use natural dyes, and they're much more transparent with where their textiles come from, who's doing the dyeing, who's doing the shipping. So I do recommend them. And when it comes to towels and bed linens, I recommend Linoto, Linoto. They use linen, like it's actual linen. Also use mostly natural dyes, and they're also very transparent about where it all comes from and who's doing the work. They're not sponsoring, right, Larissa? Okay, so this is just my personal tip that if you're looking for where to buy earth-friendly undergarments, bed linens, and towels, those are the two places that I recommend. So before I get into the craft, are there any questions? Thank you. Well, I did want to point out like the two piles of books. So I have The Golden Thread by Cassia St. Clair. This book it's just an incredible book. This is where I learned about the guy who invented the knitting machine. And it also gets into one of the main reasons why the Vikings kept invading the British Isles. Wool. What were Viking sails made of? Wool. You can't have sheep in Scandinavia. It just doesn't work. It's all rocks. So in order for the Viking ships to have sails, they would take the sails that they had, or they just rowed really, really, really hard over to the British Isles. They'd raid a bit, take a whole bunch of sheep, take a couple looms, take some people who knew how to spin and weave and dye, take them back to Scandinavia and be like, you have to make our sails now. And when a Viking ship sank, they rescued the sail. That was the most valuable item on the ship because it took 400 sheep to make one sail and the hours of labor it took to make it. So I really recommend The Golden Thread because it has so many personable stories like that where you really understand what people have gone through just for textiles and how much they have meant throughout the human story. There's Women's Work by Elizabeth Wayland Barber. This is also just wonderful, very good. This gets more into how textiles have been women's work. And it's generally because if you're pregnant, if you're nursing, if you're having babies, you're going to be at home. You might as well spin, dye, weave, and knit thread. But it was not considered like a Betty Crocker housewife thing. Like, it was industry. This was a business. The women who did this were business people. It even gets into, there's a Bible story about some men who were trying to escape, like some Roman soldiers or something. I'm sorry, it's the Old Testament. I don't remember the details. And this woman took them in and hid them in her flax. Flax is the plant that you make linen from. So what this story is telling us, she was an independent businesswoman who spun linen thread at home. This was not just some lady who was hanging out at home throwing Tupperware parties. This was a businesswoman. So more stories about how pre-Betty Crocker domestic textiles was industry. There's Worn by Sophie Thanhauser. I skimmed this one. I'm sorry, I did not have time to read the whole thing. This is also more about how textiles and humans, like, we go together. We wouldn't be here if we hadn't figured out how to spin thread. So this is more about the history of textiles. And then these, Fashionopolis by Dana Thomas and Overdressed by Elizabeth Cline. These are about fast fashion and about how the garments that we wear now just aren't as good as the textiles that people wore 100 years ago. And that's because people don't make them at home anymore. People don't even make them in this country anymore. They're made on the other side of the world, and they're not made to be good, and they're not made to benefit the people making them. They're made so that we'll buy them. So this is much more about the contemporary textiles. And then The Conscious Closet, also by Elizabeth Cline. This is about when you're buying more, what to look for, how to take care of your garments. When you buy a shirt that has a tag on it that has those little symbols, how to read those. Like, I don't know how to do that. I hate ironing, so it's like I learned the iron sign so I don't buy it. But this is much more very contemporary, very active, what you can do now. So these are the books that I have to recommend. Okay? All right, so now, unless, Larissa, there's anything in the chat. Okay, so we're going to get into the craft part. I have my fabric scissors that only I get to touch. And I also have another set of scissors if we want to pass them around. Okay. So I asked to bring old, preferably cotton textiles, preferably woven, but I know that a lot of people don't know the difference between weaving and knitting, so I didn't want to stress people out. If you brought knitted stuff, that's okay. What this shirt I'm wearing right here, this is knitted wool, and if I tried to do this craft project with this, it would just disintegrate, which would be very sad. So I brought a whole bunch of cotton garments that are old and worn and have stains and holes and all sorts of nasty stuff. I mean, you want to wear your garments until they get to that point. So I have plenty more. They're all washed. I'm not gross. So here, my Dallas ministry volunteer shirt. I don't want to wear anything that says Dallas on it, so I'm going to cut this up to demonstrate what we're doing. So what you want to do is you want to cut as long as possible strips that are roughly 2 to 3 inches wide. This is not very precise. So the longest part of this garment is the sleeve. So I'm just going to cut up the sleeve. There. This is a little bit wider than I'd wanted, but like it's fine. Again, this is very imprecise. How about if we try to prepare 3 long strips to start with? All right, so we've got some strips here. So what you're going to do is you're just going to tie very simple knot. I'm left-handed. I hope it works. So you're just going to take a very simple knot and put your wrist through it, and you want it to be nice and loose. So just a very simple knot, very, very simple knot. You want it to be flexible. What is this, a square knot? My dad was in the Coast Guard. He'd be so mad if I didn't know the name of this knot. I just did one simple knot because you want it to be very loose. You want it to move around. So with your hand in the knotted loop, grab, gently pull it through. If anybody can crochet, you can probably see where this is going. So then you have the original knotted loop, and then you have the new loop of the material that you pulled through. Here, I'll do it again. So you just make a very simple, theoretically square knot. Put your wrist through it. Grab the material, pull it through. So you have 2. And then with the second loop, put your wrist through it, and you do it again. When you get to the end, you overlap. So now I have these 2 strips. So when I go through, I'm going to grab the 2 of them together, pull them both through. So now the new strip has created the 4th loop. I'll start over. Yep, because we're going to make a spiral. So you're going to make the loop, hand through it, pull the material through, and then you're just going to pull it through again. And when you get to the end of your strip, you just overlap the new strip over it, maybe just a couple inches. And once you get to your 4th loop, now this is the tricky part for people who have never crocheted before. There's the first loop that you made with the knot. So what you're going to do, it's not going to loop nice at first. I promise you, once you get to the 4th level, then it starts to look good. So you're going to have these 2 ends of the 4 loops that you've made. You're going to put your wrist through the most recent loop that you made. Hold onto your new loop. Pull a new one through. What you're just doing is you're making a series of loops. And you're just going to continue putting your wrist through, creating new loops. This is not meant to be precise. So I like messy projects because I find that when I do precise projects, people get scared and don't do anything. Okay. So once you get there, it's going to look like a clump. You're just going to take the first loop that you made. You're going to have these 2 loops on either end. You're going to overlay them together. Yep. With your fingers through both loops, that's when you make a new one. And then as you go, you are going to continue attaching your new loop to an old loop. So you're going to continue to overlay the new loop over the old loop, and it will spiral. And like I said, it's going to be really messy for the first few levels. You're going to look at it and think, this looks like spaghetti. What am I doing? As you spiral out, it will actually start to be a circle. The question was, do I have anything on indigenous weaving and dyeing? I don't know much personally, but I do know the company Beyond Buckskin is fantastic, and they have the resources that I don't. Now, the great thing with this project is you don't need to do it all right now. This is very much something that you can just put down and come back to later, especially since we're supposed to get more gross cold weather soon. This is a very good, I'm sitting in a couch and I don't want to watch TV and my cat's being moody, so I need something to do with my hands. And I just put this by my kitchen sink so I have something nice to stand on while I'm washing dishes. And then my cat puked on it. And with all of these loose ends that are hanging out, you can tuck them in, you can sew them in if you want. I just tucked mine in underneath the rug and it never unraveled. So I have the two chains together here. I have a little bit of strip of fabric left. I'm gonna grab another strip and just overlay them. So first loop, fourth loop, holding the two pieces together, I pull through. And then I take the outermost loop that's next, still holding on to the loop I just made. I have those two together and I pull it through. So from now on, you are always going to have two loops together when you pull the strip through. So the first bit will just look like a messy clump. That's okay. Once you get several layers, it's going to be a lot easier to pick the outermost loop. They're just going to line up right there for you. So if you're just at a clump, that's okay. Yes, that's a very technical term. And then you're just going to keep on looping through. Just picking whatever the outermost loop is. And you're just going to go around and around. Like I said, this is really great when you're just sitting inside and you're watching, I don't know, what's the popular show now? You're rewatching The Walking Dead. That's the show that I can name off the top of my head. So when you're sitting inside on a rainy day and you're rewatching The Walking Dead for the 5th time, no judgment, you're just going to pick this up. And the thing is, you can make this whatever size you want. If you just keep going and you make an enormous rug, that's okay. If you wind up just making a big blanket out of it, that's okay. Because the thing is, when you make something out of old clothes that you're not wearing anymore and they're full of holes and mustard stains, because mustard is superior to ketchup, turning it into something that you're actually going to continue using in your home, that is a lot better than just throwing it out, donating it to a place where you don't really know where it's going to go.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us. Again, I'm Larissa from the Galena Public Library in Galena, Illinois. We do have programming regularly posted to Eventbrite that's free and virtual to join in on. And we also put a lot of recorded programming on our YouTube channel at Galena Public Library on YouTube. So be sure to check that out. Thank you very much and have a good night.